Respect for legitimate democratic aspirations leads to good outcomes. Disrespecting it in one way or another, and often surprisingly, can lead to bad outcomes for everyone.
Distinguished guests, President Ivanov, Your Excellencies, first allow me to thank the School of Young Leaders and the initiative for having me over for the second time to chair the key panel of the Cultural Forum. My name is Ivica Bocevski. I also would like to thank President Ivanov for the opportunity he gave me to serve my country in the capacity of the diplomatic advisor to the President of the Republic and as the first Macedonian ambassador to Brazil and to South America. If you look at the program, you'll see that I have a very long title nowadays. It's due to the fact that my country is still a candidate for membership in the European Union. It's a very sad story, and it reflects the opposite of the title of the panel, which is Leadership, Cultural Bridges and Legal Frameworks in Post-Conflict Reconciliation. Just to give you a perspective, when I was a teenager, my country was called Yugoslavia, and my Macedonia was only part of that Yugoslavia. As teenagers, we dreamt at that time, and we were hoping that us, the country, joining the European Union is just around the corner. We really expected that the moment the single act enters into force, on January the 1st, 1993, that besides the original 12 members of the European Union, also former Yugoslavia will join the European Union. What happened in the meantime? Poor leadership and blowing up of the cultural bridges, but also blowing up of the physical bridges led to unprecedented war, and also all the frameworks and fora for dialogue and reconciliation were deconstructed. Instead of us becoming members of the European Union, we were just silently watching our country collapse into the flames of war, and also we were watching our neighbors becoming members of the European Union. It's 2024, and my daughter became an adult. Still, my country is not a member of the European Union, unfortunately. It reflects what happens when there is a poor leadership and when we deconstruct the cultural bridges. So, President Ivanic, for the second time actually in my life, I was only a kid when I visited Bosnia and Herzegovina for the first time. But I was a 19-year-old student in 1995, just 6 months after the signing of the Dayton Peace Agreement. And I remember at that time a delegation of the European students, including 2 Macedonians and 3 Slovenes. We visited the universities, both universities in Mostar, University of Banja Luka, universities of Sarajevo and Tuzla, and it was a horrible but also a life-forming experience for us to witness a country still divided, different uniforms. We received different stamps in our passports while traveling throughout Bosnia, and we thought that it's hopeless at that time, that the country does not stand a chance, especially when talking to our peers at the university. But there was a courageous generation of leaders, young leaders at that time, including yourself, who took the opportunity to start the reconciliation, even though in the meantime, we are seeing how pendulum in Bosnia always switches from reconciliation to ethnic nationalism back and forth. And my question to you is, President Ivanic, will the pendulum in Bosnia finally swing towards reconciliation and European integration? And is there something that the international community and fora such as this one can do in order to facilitate the reconciliation, to facilitate the European integration of Bosnia? Thank you.
Thank you very, very much for this nice introduction, Ivica. And at the beginning, I also really have a pleasure to be today here. And thank you, dear friend, President Ivanov, for inviting me in this session, and Academy, and all these organizers. If I have the real answer on that question, I deserve the Nobel Prize, because speaking about the Bosnia, it's not so easy, because Bosnia, from the historical point of view, was always in the time of the peace and always in the time of the conflicts. We typically said to each other, you know, it's so nice to live in Bosnia because people here with a different religion, different ethnicities could work together. But every 40 years, all of us become crazy and we start a war. So it's difficult to be at that time there. In the meantime, it's not so bad. It's relatively good. Now, there is a big challenge because the last war was really a war, because 3% of the population in Bosnia was killed. 40% of the population was displaced. Bosnia today looks different than before. It's not so mixed like it was. It's more collection of the territories where one group is majority. And but honestly speaking, if I compare the difficulties of that war with the current situation, I think that Bosnia is the last, maybe last, successful example of international intervention, globally speaking. After the Bosnia, I cannot remember a case where the international community was so successful, because at the end of the day, we live in a relatively peaceful situation with a lot of tensions, but not the conflicts. And the reason for that, honestly, is because all the big players were together. This is the last time when the Russia, United States, European Union were together, having the same opinion. After that, I can't remember that, and if I see the situation in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Middle East, everywhere there was division, and immediately there was no solution. Internally, we have a lot of challenges, in spite of the fact that the war finished almost 30 years ago. Do we have a real reconciliation? Unfortunately, I cannot say yes. I have to say, until now, still the answer is no. Why? Because when you have some sort of the civil war within the country, there is something which is common. Everybody believes, all the sides believe that they are the victims. And if there is something common in Bosnia, this is the feeling that my part was a victim. All the others were wrong. We were only innocent, all the others were responsible. And there will be a need for a long time just to be patient enough to reduce these tensions and then to start to really rebuild the real reconciliation. Of course, the role of the leaders there is extremely important. You can have NGOs speaking nicely, trying to rebuild the trust among the people, but this will not have so big influence like the real political leaders who will promote that. Did we have it in the past years in Bosnia? No. I like examples, so I will say one example. At the beginning of my duty, when I was a member of the Presidency, I proposed to the other two members, I am a Serb, Orthodox, there were two other members, Bosniaks, Muslims, Croats, Catholics. And so we don't have a single president. We have presidency, so that means I'm not the real president, I'm 1/3 of the real president, which is even more difficult than to be a president, because you have to negotiate with the others. And I proposed something which didn't happen until then, and even didn't happen after that, because we couldn't succeed. My proposal was that three of us will visit the places where the three ethnic groups suffered, were killed. That we will all go there together and to pay the tribute for the victims. And we said that we will not speak, we will be there just to put the flowers, that the religious leaders of that community will pray in front of other religious leaders and us, and that we will show to the public that we respect all the victims and let's try to rebuild a trust. Unfortunately, we didn't succeed because one member said, okay, two of you can have one place, I need two places because my part was the biggest victim, and we didn't succeed. Everything was agreed. Even the religious leaders agreed to that proposal. They believe it was good. And unfortunately, we didn't succeed that. So how we can build a trust among the people, which is the key if you are faced with a society with a conflict. The key is a trust among the ordinary people. That is the real challenge, how to build a trust, not immediately full reconciliation, but at least a trust that the other side is honest enough. Without the real leaders, it's very difficult. As I said, NGOs, they can have their role, media, they can have their role, definitely it's important, but as long as you don't have politicians ready to show that, it's very difficult to rebuild that. We didn't have these politicians, and because of that, I still believe that the real reconciliation is still not there. Bosnia, like country, is not more complicated than Swiss or Switzerland or Belgium. It's not more complicated, but there is one big difference. They honestly accepted the rules. We are trying still to cheat, to make some Balkan ways to misuse the rules to be in a better position. Once we accept that, I think that we can be very optimistic about the stability of Bosnia. Bosnia is definitely needs, maybe even more than any other country of the region, to be a part of European Union. Once we are the part of the larger community, we are not so bad, because our internal differences then are immediately irrelevant. But as long as we are isolated, we are pressed to be, against each other. By being a member of the larger community, our internal differences are less relevant. We have to accept the rules developed somewhere else, not among us. So there are no real reasons for the political conflicts. Unfortunately, based on your experience, I may be even more pessimistic than you, because being so long in politics, I experienced very strange behavior, especially from the Brussels. Because all these years when I was alone in a political scene, always formal statement was, our doors are open to you from the Western Balkans. I was in one informal dinner before the European Council meeting, when the key leader said, that was in 2006, after Croatia, there will be no more enlargement for the decades. Not one decade, but decades. And now we are 2 decades after that meeting, and maybe I am becoming old, and because of becoming old, a little bit too pessimistic. My impression is that during my lifetime there will be no more. There will be no enlargement in the European Union. And I said to a group of the colleagues, I'm ready to pay the lunch for all of you if I'm wrong. But I'm relatively experienced person to have these statements. So generally for the young generation, if you want to be the leaders, you have to take very often the steps which are not always welcomed by the public. If you want to be just politician, just do what the public expects and you will be successful. But the real leaders, they have to do from time to time something which is not always completely accepted by the public. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, President Ivanic. We don't want to be so pessimistic, even though I have to remind you of the fact that the official who started the Turkish negotiations with the European Union has just died. Yeah, so unfortunately, those things can take a very long time. But speaking of real leadership, today we also have on our panel First Minister Salmond, and I would like him to talk on the outcomes of 2 referenda and the reconciliation after those 2 referenda. In the first case, you led the effort to resurrect an old nation, the Scottish nation, and the referendum was very tight, though at the end the Remain vote in that case produce a result. You led also the reconciliation effort after that referendum. You've heard us and our aspirations to join the European Union, yet another referendum led your country to leave the European Union, even though Scotland voted to remain in the European Union. Right now, we're also part of the efforts to reconcile both the British and the Scottish society after those events. Fortunately, in your case, the referendum did not end up in violence, such as in Bosnia. We remember that the referendum in 1992 ended up in a full-blown war afterwards. So is there a lesson that Scotland can teach us, the rest of Europe, about how to deal with the outcomes of the democratic vote, even if the vote does not express our deepest feelings, aspirations, and agenda? Thank you.
Well, Chairman, I'm always reluctant to teach lessons to other people in other countries. And can I just say to the President here that if I say anything wrong, then I will not be buying lunch for lots of people. I'm Scottish, after all. We don't do these sort of things. The process is quite interesting. There were many successful things about the process of trying to reclaim Scottish independence. There was no violence. I mean, Scotland is not unique in the world, but it's unusual in that the process of self-determination in the modern era in Scotland, in the democratic era, has been achieved without a single person losing their life. In fact, nobody's had so much as a nosebleed. I think the worst excess in the entire referendum campaign of 10 years ago was that somebody got an egg thrown at them, which is hardly in the great excesses of politics. So that was an extraordinary success. And that was enabled, of course, because people on each side of the argument knew that there was a process by which the argument could be decided, i.e. a referendum, a square go, as we might call it in the Scottish vernacular, an even contest whereby people could to resolve a situation. Now, that's a successful thing, and of course it's not just one side. I mean, that has to be agreed by both sides. There's no point having a one-sided agreement. That wouldn't achieve anything. And I suppose the Edinburgh Agreement I signed with David Cameron in 2012, David Cameron being the United Kingdom Prime Minister and the lead unionist, is an example of an agreement whereby two opposing sides, came to a decision to hold a referendum and agreed to abide by the outcome. So all that's successful. There hasn't been violence since the referendum, but of course there have been very negative consequences. Negative consequences because of the result. Negative consequences for Scotland in that, as you rightly say, Scotland, because it's not independent, despite the fact that every single area and district of Scotland voted to remain in the European Union, every single one, all 32 districts, was taken out of the European Union because of the predominance of the votes in England against. So that's clearly a major negative consequences. There are many others I could point to. The wastage of resources, not just oil and gas, but the renewable resources in terms of the lack of benefit for the Scottish people. I mean, we have been the only country in history to discover oil and gas in substantial quantities and become relatively poorer. And we seem like we're well on the road to becoming the country which produces 10 times its electricity requirements and yet has a substantial percentage of its old people who freeze in the winter. And that sort of fuel poverty among energy plenty is a dreadful situation. So there's been negative consequences for Scotland. What's less understood is the negative consequences for England. It is a reasonable supposition that if Scotland had voted for independence, then England 2 years later would not have voted to leave the European Union. I mean, for a start, David Cameron would have resigned as Prime Minister, as I resigned as First Minister when I lost the referendum. If he'd lost the Scottish referendum, he would have resigned as Prime Minister. It was his commitment to have the referendum on the European Union. But also the whole nature and psychology of that referendum would have been fundamentally different. if indeed it had taken place at all. So that has been a huge diminution of the United Kingdom's role in the world. And of course, if you look at the UK political scene now, the two major parties of state, the parties which have ruled the United Kingdom for the last 100 years, in the case of the Conservative Party for much longer than that, are both in huge disarray. I mean, the Labour Party has just won an enormous election victory, and 2-3 months later is flat on its back. You know, seems unable to govern. And the Conservative Party are just going through a leadership contest where the candidate who was emerging as the most formidable candidate has probably been knocked out by the votes of the members of Parliament before they got to send him to the Conservative electorate. So both major parties of state are in disarray. The economy is in serious trouble. The social life of England has huge tensions. There's a rise of a populist right-wing party which threatens the political establishment. So the interesting thing is, although Scotland obviously lost an opportunity, the UK has been diminished. And just one further point, although, you know, in referendum you must expect outside influences of some kind or another. The European Union of that time, President Barroso in particular, was not helpful at all to Scotland. I sympathise greatly with your difficulties at the present moment. I think it's fair to say that President Juncker, his successor, would have taken a different stance because he was a Prime Minister of a small country. But Barroso was not at all helpful. In fact, was secretly combining with the United Kingdom or the UK government. Well, what happened as a result of that is the UK, as one of the major players in the European Union, ended up leaving 18 months later. So in many ways, it was a bad outcome for Europe as a whole. On the subject of what we're talking about, to reconcile differences, you need a legal framework. You need a situation where people are prepared to say that is the treaty or agreement or understanding. You certainly need leadership because usually to get that framework in place requires the leaders of various parties or countries or factions to go beyond their own particular interest and try to understand the interests of the other side. And I do think very strongly you need the cultural bridge release. And Northern Ireland, which we might come to later, would be a very positive example of how cultural understanding has helped promote a peace which seemed so elusive for so long. My general message is respect for legitimate democratic aspirations leads to good outcomes. Disrespecting it in one way or another, and often surprisingly, can lead to bad outcomes for everyone. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And ladies and gentlemen, it is our honor here to have Yossi Beilin, the architect, leading architect of Oslo and Geneva Accords. Minister Beilin, we would like to hear your experience on working, designing and implementing those both accords. And can your experience with Oslo and Geneva serve as a path for reconciliation between Israel and Palestine nowadays, and also for a wider reconciliation in the region of the Middle East, which will potentially bring peace to the Eastern Mediterranean and diminish those negative consequences that we face right now in this moment? So please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Well, the Oslo Agreement was an interim agreement, and one of its downsides was that it was perceived by the world and in a way by the parties as a permanent peace agreement. After all, very few people get into the details of agreements. The agreements are very boring. And so those who wrote the agreements usually know what they wrote. It's not the rule, by the way. But the assumption is that they know what they wrote, that they read the annexes, that they know the details. But the general public is not required to read every word. And usually it is pictures, and those who remember, the picture of the Oslo agreement was a tall young person with two other leaders on his two sides. The tall guy was the new American president who had no experience in international affairs, needed badly a success. And we brought him this success without any involvement. So he was very happy. And made out of it a big, big deal. So that people, and the others were, of course, Yitzhak Rabin and Yasser Arafat. So the world was very happy. I mean, any agreement by the two sides, like the Dayton Agreement. I mean, okay, you have an agreement, Dayton, fine. We are very happy that the two rivals got an agreement at the end of the day. We can write a V, it's okay. But Oslo was the beginning. And the international enthusiasm around Oslo became very soon the enemy of the continuation, because people were very frustrated. How come you signed a peace agreement? Why do you still kill each other? Stop it. So I believe that there was a mistake. Oslo was a continuation of a process, of the Madrid process, and it was agreed in advance that it would be only an interim agreement. But I think that our biggest mistake was not to insist upon having a permanent agreement immediately, without waiting for, trust and confidence buildings and all these things which are important, but take time. And we don't have time. Time is running. So it was very easy among the two delegations which met for the first time, because the Israelis were forbidden from talking to the PLO organization people. And we met for the first time in Norway on the 20th of January 1993, 4 days after this, there was the law passed in the Knesset, which enables us to meet with the other side. So this was by itself the revolution, to meet legally with the other side. And it was so easy to create good relations with the other side, to understand the other side. Because the biggest secret is not necessarily that they trust each other, but that they have the same goal. And our same goal was to succeed and to have an agreement. So in the negotiating room, in the secret negotiating room, it was the easiest thing to do. What happened later on is that, in a way, there was, I believe, too much trust. I think that the point of too much trust is not taken seriously. Because what is happening in the negotiating room, which is a very unique room, and not enough was written about it. The dynamics in the negotiating room create, for example, a club of negotiators from both sides. Their main aim very soon become negotiating with whom? With their bosses. And they are telling them, no, we asked you, don't give up on this point or another point. And The negotiators are saying, Mr. Prime Minister or Mr. President, but we got something else that was very important for us. So this is the negotiations which is taking place. But what is the exaggerated trust? The trust which is built in the negotiating room is the trust between negotiators, not between peoples. And if I may, I can give you an example. And it is, I think, a very, very telling example. Because at a certain point, and not at the end, at the beginning, the Palestinian side said, one of the articles of our interim agreement should be that until we have a permanent agreement, Israel stops all the settlements in the occupied territories, in the West Bank and Gaza. Now, for us negotiators, it was not something totally crazy. All of us were against settlements. So it wasn't such a big deal that the other side is asking us to stop settlements. We talked with Prime Minister Rabin and said this is for them a crucial issue. 5 years, can you imagine, 5 years of interim agreement, and all these 5 years, the Israeli side is building territory, settlements. So we have to agree to freeze it. Rabin said, no, take into account the government resolution 360 from 92. It was a very important resolution, which actually said that Israel unilaterally stops the settlements. It had many reservations, whether public constructions or private or whatever, but this was a very important statement that he, Prime Minister Rabin, wanted to tell the world, I am doing it by myself. Here come the Palestinians and say, now you have to stop settlements. Hey, I did it. So tell the other side that it is not needed, and if I agree to it, it will be seen as if I surrendered to the Palestinians in doing something which I wanted to do. And I have a resolution, public, you can look at it. Here comes the trust. We talked to our counterparts and said, you know, Rabin has a case. Although we agree with you that we should stop it, we should officially stop it, but for him, you can trust it. He is a man of his word, and nobody is going to deceive you, and there will be no settlements, actually. They consulted, they did not like the idea. Eventually, they came to us and said, we agree to it. For Rabin, it was a very big achievement. But it was a huge mistake. A huge mistake. Why? Because it was part of the agreement. It was not a special, I mean, after a few years, as you know, Rabin was assassinated. Somebody else replaced him. Immediately it was Peres, but after a few months it was Bibi Netanyahu. And Netanyahu said, I mean, the peace camp in Israel said, you should stop the settlements. And he said, show me, where is it written? Do you have some proof? And we said, no, it was trust. You know this name, this word, trust. There was a mutual trust, and we said that we will not build settlements. He said, with all due respect, if it is not part of the agreement, I don't have to fulfill it. And I think that for any negotiator, it is very, very important. Don't be misled by the trust which is created in the room of the negotiators. because they are there temporarily. They can be replaced politically, they may retired, they may die, and some of them even may be assassinated, God forbid. So if you want to have a solid agreement, don't think about the trust in the other side of the table. It is not enough. We did not want to deceive the Palestinians. They did not want to deceive us around the table. But behind us, there were people. And if you don't decide very clearly what are the points of the agreement, you may pay a huge price. And we actually paid the price. Of course, the Palestinians stood, because we did not want to continue the settlements. And since there was another government which legitimately wanted to have more settlements and to breach the international law or whatever, we did not have a tool to tell them, you have to do that. So I'm referring to trust because it seems obvious that you have to build trust and you have to have reconciliation. I mean, yes, it is important. It is important that you sit around the table and you know that the other side is not telling you lies about the agreement, or even about his or her intentions. But don't replace this trust. Don't misunderstand that this trust goes beyond your immediate negotiators.
Professor Popovic, you served as a judge at the European Court of Human Rights, a very important institution in establishing legal frameworks, also for reconciliation. However, there are two situations where the European Court of Human Rights has made rulings benefiting reconciliation, such as the case Sejdić-Finci, the famous case in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and also in the case of the registration of the Macedonian political parties in Bulgaria. There are so far 14 rulings by the European Court of Human Rights clearly stating that they need to be recognized, yet Bulgaria still refuses to recognize those institutions. So what happens when the legal framework is just ignored by the sides who decided to accede to those treaties? How do we move on? How can we use the law for reconciliation?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Your question will make me disregard what I have written in preparation for this roundtable. Yes, there were many rulings of the European Court of Human Rights which were problematic to carry on in reality, in cases against Bosnia and Herzegovina, in cases against Bulgaria and many others. It is a problem. It is a problem of the European network of institutions and the implementation of international law within the framework of the European Convention on Human Rights. It is very difficult to answer your questions because the cases are different. They are not the same. They have their specific aspects, and such aspects should be taken into account. Let me remind you of the first case against Bosnia and Herzegovina, Sejdić and Finci. Mr. Ivanic knows that better than I do, but because I was not in the formation. And it posed a certain obligation upon Bosnia and Herzegovina as a member state of the Council of Europe to implement the ruling. It wasn't that easy, but I remember talking to the then judge for Bosnia and Herzegovina, my colleague Ljiljana Mijović, who explained to me, and I cannot repeat it because it was very complicated, very sophisticated, that the politicians have reached some sort of conclusion how to implement that judgment of the European Court of Human Rights. It was complicated, but it was possible, but nothing came out of it, much to our regret, I must say. And then there were other rulings, so it is very difficult because it's a problem of the international level and the national level of jurisdiction. And when a government is supposed to do something, it raises problems within a member state. I'll give you an example. There was a ruling about the situation in prisons in Italy. And Italy was required to introduce some improvements, etc., etc. Then the Italian government protested, saying, yes, but we want to be the decision makers within our budget. We want to pay for the schools or something else, or military equipment, who cares? We do not have the money for the prisons. So you see, it's very complex. An international institution, an international court, by way of rendering judgments, intervenes into the internal politics of a member state. Where is the frontier? How should we deal with that? It is very difficult to say, and perhaps the new generations will be much more inventive than we were. It was first of all an achievement to make an individual claim his rights before an international tribunal. We should not underestimate that. And now we are in another sort of, in another round, so to speak, how to improve the mechanism. But the mechanism has also other problems. I'm speaking of the mechanism of the European Court of Human Rights. One of the great problems is that Russia left the family of the member states. They were dissatisfied with the rulings against the Russian state, the Russian government, and it's a pity that they left. And I'm very pessimistic about the possibility that they rejoin the Council of Europe, especially the European Court of Human Rights. Therefore, we need new perspectives, new horizons to open, and we should think of imagination. Political imagination, which is always useful. We need leaders, brave, bold leaders, who can break through. And that is the case of the European Court of Human Rights and the whole of the mechanism of the protection of human rights in Europe. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, next we have Ambassador Bogyay, coming from Hungary. I won't try with my Hungarian because I just started learning it. I'll massacre the language for sure. I wanted to ask you, Madam Ambassador, the role of diplomacy is to build bridges, and those bridges eventually needs to be crossed one day, either by the diplomats who build them or by others who will actually use the efforts of the diplomats. You served on multilateral fora, both representing your country, and also you served as the president of UNESCO. So is multilateral diplomacy still serving this purpose of building bridges, even in the case when bridges do not exist, and even in the case when nobody wants to cross them? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Mr. President, thank you very much for inviting us. Mr. Undersecretary General, it's good to see you. Yes, I missed the UN in New York, but I'm still around. And Mr. Mayor, you have an amazing city. I was told yesterday by your president, whoever comes here once, it will be not the last one. So looking forward to continuing this visit. And thank you very much, Mark, for inviting me again. It's like being totally, utterly inspired by all our discussions and by the amazing panelists and lecturers here, but mainly by the audience. I must say that the whole theme of our discussion is something very close to my heart, because yes, I've been serving my country, but in a way the world or humanity, whatever chapeau I was having on, in the multilateral scene. And I think that, yes, sometimes still the only platform. So we can always talk about the need of the reform process, the end of the UN, and so on and so on. Okay, but what's instead of that? So we have platforms, multilateral platforms, where we have to go in, ambassadors are meeting each other, the diplomats are meeting each other, we are sitting at the same table, even when the countries are not talking with each other, the politicians are not talking with each other, or when, you know, they are in war with each other. So these platforms are, I think, very, very important. Just lately, we actually celebrated the International Day of Peace, and I want just to say that the theme of 2024 of the International Day of Peace was cultivating a culture of peace. And here I am at my territory, which is mainly soft power diplomacy, because 25 years ago, when we decided to have this amazing program, the Culture of Peace, you know, it was decided at the United Nations, but actually UNESCO has been dealing with the series of programs and putting together the deeper understanding of the culture of peace worldwide. We really have to realize that the culture of peace is not something what is there per se, but we really have to work on that every day. And what I made just some notes, what I want to touch today very quickly. For me, if I want to talk about this topic, comes to my mind 4 very important ingredients or actors in this topic. And one ingredient is the role of women in peace building, in building peace, understanding, and just referring to you, Mr. Minister, when women are invited to the table of the negotiation tables, and they insist on both sides putting the important topics into the document, then it can work. But I was told in many parts of the world that they had the trust, they had the promises, but it was not put into the paper. And after they made the deal, the peace agreement, no one really dealt seriously, for example, with the topics what the women thought was very important. And I also learned this from Betty Williams, who was a Nobel Peace Prize laureate in 1977 in Northern Ireland. Wonderful woman. And she told me, peace is action and not words. Very much related to what the president of Malta was talking about. Yes, so obviously here are very distinguished politicians who have been doing the work, the action. It's not enough to just talk about that. But I think really the cause of empowering women to take leading roles in the positive social transformations towards peace is especially very important. And I don't believe that this job has been done. So I would like very much to propose here, I see great young women leaders in the audience. Never forget your journey. And never forget the journey which is waiting still for other women and other girls. And whenever you do something, remember in the UN we say, we do it together, you know, we step it up together, we race for each other. So never forget that. It's not obvious everywhere in the world. So it's not done yet. So I think leadership is, of course, often defined within the sphere of politics, but I think many women have been doing it anyway in their territories, in their fields. I've been, for example, in Colombia, and I met many women who have been very vocal in the peace processes, and they've been doing it in their communities, in their villages, and also at the negotiating table. So it can work, and your voice is needed, and your voice should be heard. Going back to the institutions, the United Nations Security Council had this very important resolution, that's the famous 1325 resolution, Women, Peace and Security, which has been going on, discussing, using. Very many peace negotiators are using it, having it in their hands. I've seen it. The UN said that we agreed on that. Please let us have our space in the negotiations. So I think the potential, the knowledge, the talent of women in fostering peace and nurture reconciliation is something what we all have to work on and take it into consideration. The second point I want to do is the role of art. I very much believe that art, in a way, can empower us and can save us. Why do I say that? Because it can save us because through doing and absorbing it, we can transform ourselves into compassionate beings. And that is really something what art can do. For example, just lately, for the International Day of Peace, I invited women ambassadors in Hungary. Often, they were in war or not in diplomatic relations with each other, and I asked them to bring a piece by a women artist of their country and bring a poem by a woman poet of their country. And we presented all this together. And at the end of the day, we saw the common ground. We were, in a way, deeply, very often talking about similar things, wishes, and desires. And of course, art has got a very important role because it makes us daring, very often more daring than in our normal everyday life. So use it. If you do soft power diplomacy, use art. It's a strong platform. Now in Hungary, we are organizing a big program for artists from tormented areas, coming together, working together. Every little piece of negotiation and looking for common ground can help us in that. And yes, art can save us because it elucidates a path towards peaceful coexistence. Thirdly, we talked about the importance of cooperation. It is not so obvious. I was told many often in my career as a diplomat when I was talking about the importance of dialogue that, yeah, but I am in dialogue. And I said, so what do you mean? For me, dialogue is that we all listen to each other and probably have the capacity to change our way of thinking or our standpoint. And this very ambassador told me, he said, well, dialogue for me is that I'm talking and you are listening. So it's, again, not a finished business. We have to work on that, what dialogue really is, and that's really the starting point for cooperation. And I think through the culture bridge building, looking for countries where it works very well, we can start or assist the hard work very often of politicians. And I don't really want to overlook that most societies have also tremendous indigenous knowledge, actually, how to live together. That's another thing. Why don't we look into that? Very often it happens. We know it happens. So go into that. For example, I'm a European, but a very great supporter of Ubuntu as a philosophy because it really defines the person, someone who belongs to a community. And in Europe especially, we are very slowly forgetting about the community. And I want to say, of course, Hungary has always been a great supporter of you entering the European Union because we believe in that kind of dialogue, and we really remember the times when we had this aspiration and how important it was also in our life. And lastly, I would like to emphasize the importance of education. Probably we don't have enough time to talk about that, but I think it's a great thought. What I read, that in the long course of history, having people who understand your thought is much greater in security than another submarine. And of course, it was Mr. Fulbright, and he is right. That's why it is so important to give scholarships by the governments. That's why it's so important you all to apply to as many scholarships, as many you can. We are also offering the Stipendium Hungaricum, and that's amazing that we have all these foreign students from all over the world mingling with each other, learning about each other, and when you are having scholarships, you know, you are really going through your own borders and building the bridges in long term. So education is something what should be taken seriously. That's why the programs of UNESCO in the international collaborations on the field of education culture, not to talk about science or communication, are so important. So I just would like to say to the students here or the young leaders, never shy away to use soft power diplomacy, because very often people smile about it, but it's not. It's a long-term bridge-building exercise or process, and you can see the results of that. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Ambassador. And last but not least, we have Rashela Mizrahi, member of the Macedonian Parliament, a woman leader, and also the first Jewish member of the Parliament in independent Macedonia. Just for the foreigners who don't understand the depth of the Holocaust, which happened here, in just 3 days, 80 years ago, a community which was here for 500 years basically disappeared. As an ambassador to South America, I witnessed the sad fact that only in the city of Temuco, which is the third largest city in Chile, there are more Jewish people from Bitola living there than the entire Jewish community of Macedonia nowadays. And Macedonia is taking great measures in the fight against anti-Semitism and also in preservation of the memory of the Macedonian Jews. The Ministry of Culture, represented here by the Minister, and also the Republic of Macedonia is taking a special care to also renew and to reconstruct the public spaces of the life of the Jewish community in the past. But Rashela has a very nice insight into Macedonian multiculturalism, explaining how an old and ancient community also serves as a bridge among various Macedonian linguistic, ethnic, and religious cleavages. So, Madam Parliamentarian, please address the panel.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. It's such a pleasure to be here among you all. Ladies and gentlemen, young leaders, Mr. Mayor, ministers, and of course, my dearest friend, President Ivanov. Thank you so much for inviting me year by year on the School of Young Leaders. I think the brainstorm you put upon us, all of us, not only the students, but also the lecturers, is amazing. We don't have many experiences like this during the year. I would start by saying I dislike the word politician. I think it's a bad word. I would like to be a good storyteller. And year by year, here I can address all of you and tell a nice, true story. I was born in 1981 in Yugoslavia. Belonging to a small community in a big country, we believe that we live Baška and Barabar. In Turkish, it means separated, but as one. We have lived like this for hundreds of years. Jews were never really separated, always really integrated, but remembering their culture, like everybody else. Since 1981, Yugoslavia fell into pieces. My generation witnessed war. Slovenia, Croatia, Serbia, Bosnia, Kosovo, even the Macedonian crisis. We kind of adjust ourselves to realizing that this region is always going to be in war, and as our books told us, even as children, I am the child that was born and grew up in a gunpowder barrel. But is that all? Ladies and gentlemen, it is more certainly not. We just don't tell the stories of our untold heroes loud enough. During the conflict in Macedonia, there was a group of 5 friends. Those 5 friends were the leader of the Jewish community, Islamic community, Orthodox Christian community, Catholic community, and the Methodist community. While seeing what was going on in Bosnia, they sat down as friends and they said, we are not going to use the word tolerance, we are going to use the word respect and love. They portrayed their love and respect to the level that it was just passed on to all the believers in the country. That group of 5 leaders didn't allow the intolerance and the conflict from ex-Yugoslavia to be transmitted to Macedonia. Many of you don't know this story because it's in the shadows. We just see the politicians. I have to use this opportunity to just read what they did as a group of 5 friends. They did the Dialogue Between Civilizations Forum. They did the summits of religious leaders, inter-religious meetings of priests and imams that were hugging each other in Ohrid, inside of friendship and agreement between them. It was a signature of the Joint Message for Peace from all religious leaders in 2001. Conferences for the promotion and enrichment of interreligious cooperation in the country and outside it. They were members of the boards for interreligious cooperation. They had numerous conferences for the promotion of freedom of religious and belief in the Republic of Macedonia and beyond. They were counseling of religious communities and religious groups in Republic of Macedonia and beyond. They were a long-time collaborator of the Macedonian Center for International Cooperation. They actively participated in the drafting of the law of religious communities and religious groups. They were actively participating in calming inter-ethnic and inter-religious tensions during 2001 conflict. They advocated for the implementation of religious education in school from a cultural and philosophical point of view in order to get to know each other and bring people together. They were the original creators of the Interreligious Conference of Peace in Macedonia. They were the initiator of the creator of the leadership meetings for religious leaders in the occasion of the opening of a memorial center in 2011, and many other activities. Ladies and gentlemen, one of those 5 common people from the shadows of peace was my father. He passed away 2 years ago, but let this not be a tribute to him. This is a tribute to all of you young leaders here. I want you to know that the only way to preserve peace is to really want one. Really want one. Because war starts with a couple of whiskey glasses on a green table. And it ends like that. And there are no winners or losers. There are only survivors. When we talk about conflicts in Ukraine, the Middle East, or Africa, for a mother sitting in the shadow of some underground with her children, does it matter who will win or lose? She just wants her children to survive. Young leaders, never forget, you can be heroes from the shadow without being a great name in politics. Never forget that the 5 whiskey glasses that begin a war will end the war in the same table on a very similar meeting. But the heroes of peace are usually in the shadows. This is an infinite game. Let us be the winners from the shadows. Thank you.
So, there was supposed to be a second round of discussion here, but I think we were quite inspired this morning and most probably had a very strong breakfast. So the speeches were a bit longer than expected. So I have to open the discussion for questions from the audience. I know that there are many eager participants of the School of Young Leaders who would like to ask our distinguished panelists some questions. So please just raise your hand and wait for the microphone to be delivered. So I see a lady over there and also a gentleman behind her. And then another lady in the 4th row here.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for the very interesting panel. I have 2 questions, one for Mr. Salmond and one for Mr. Beilin. Mr. Salmond, one policy of your party is to grant oil licenses to the North Sea. with carbon capture as a condition. Given the growing environmental concerns and the skepticism around carbon capture, as a political leader, have you considered any other strategies to protect the environment and ensure Scotland's sustainable economic growth? And Mr. Beilin, how do you assess Netanyahu's accountability for the current military strategies? And what mechanisms could be put in place to ensure that leaders are held accountable for their actions? Thank you.
Well, a range of environmental initiatives. I'm one of the few prime ministers, leaders, first ministers in the world who managed to not just keep to climate change targets, but exceed them through my term of office. We were 4% ahead of our targets on climate change and carbon reductions 6 years early when I left office. We were already ahead of the 2020 targets in 2014. And basically, the major reason for achieving that was the vast expansion of onshore wind power, which left Scotland, again, one of the few countries in the world, self-sufficient in renewable energy. Now, where Scotland produces effectively 100% of its electrical power at the present moment from mainly wind power, but also hydropower and other renewable sources. So, look, my track record on these matters is pretty strong. I've been interested in carbon capture for a long time. I started my working career as an oil economist, and I also know a reasonable amount, I'm not a geologist, about the geology of the North Sea. If there is a single place in the planet that capturing carbon will work, it's likely to be in the saline aquifers of the North Sea. And the reason for saying that is not a question of theory, it's a question of practice. Because in order to increase oil output from particular wells, carbon dioxide has been, and other substances incidentally, have been injected into these aquifers and oil wells for the last 40 years in the North Sea. Therefore, and there's been no leakage or escapes of any degree of that carbon dioxide. Therefore, it's a technology which is well worth trying. I've been pursuing it since 2007 when there was a project called the Miller Project, which basically was going to take the sour gas pipelines, that means they're very strong, very impervious, which had brought gas from the North Sea and reverse that and take the carbon dioxide back into the North Sea wells. If that technology is successful at scale, it will be the single biggest transformation in reduction of greenhouse gases that the planet can envisage over the next 10 years. Therefore, it's a world responsibility for it to be tried, for it to be invested in, and it's to the shame of successive Westminster governments that they haven't done it since 2007, and every time there's been an initiative, it's been retreated from. It's particularly difficult because the best way to capture carbon to 100% is not to let it go through an industrial process and then to try and extract the carbon back out. The best way is to take methane gas and at landing point convert it into hydrogen and carbon dioxide, take the carbon dioxide back into where it came from and use the hydrogen as a clean burn fuel. And promoting a hydrogen economy. So, yeah, I'm a huge advocate of carbon capture. I do it from a background of renewable energy. I hope and believe that the power that we have available and the new energy revolution in Scotland, mostly from offshore wind, which is the biggest and at the present moment, the lowest price form of generating electricity. I hope that will be used for the benefit of the people of Scotland, not just for international capital. I hope it will be used to keep people warm in the winter in an environmentally sensitive way, not just to rake in profits for governments to waste on munitions and weapons of war and all the daft things they tend to do with large endowments. So that's what I stand for in terms of my environmental responsibilities, and I hope that the present generation of politicians will pursue that line. I'm sure that the people here would want to pursue that line.
Minister Beilin.
Well, thank you for your question. Mr. Netanyahu is a right-wing leader. As a right-wing leader, he opposes, or I oppose, many of his policies, being a center-leftist. But from time to time, and I have a witness in the audience who sits in the first row, Mr. Moratinos, he was open to hear something. For example, the decision that there will be an EU special envoy to the peace process in '96 was taken by Netanyahu. He agreed to it, and here is the envoy, which was a very big surprise because he is anything which is international, UN, EU, you name it. And not to speak about UNESCO. I mean, he is against all the international because he believes that the whole world is against us. Sometimes it is true, but not every time. And because of that, we should not take them seriously. But when there were other ideas, like the very problematic Trump peace plan. But it was an idea for a two-state solution, almost crazy between us. But two-state solution, and he supported it. So for people like myself, for the peace camp in Israel, whoever puts us in a better solution vis-a-vis peace, we say, okay, we will support your decision. And Sharon went unilaterally from Gaza. I was very much against it, but I supported it in the parliament because it is better to leave Gaza than to remain in Gaza for Israel. Now, what happened to him is that once he was indicted for bribery, and the danger of prison became a real danger for him, he was ready to invite to his government whoever gives him the majority. That is the story. Because he vouched, on TV, and it is always shown in us on TV, he said, Ben Gvir would never be on my government. Never, ever. And he put him there. And he really did something which is, in my view, a crime to the state of Israel to have such people on our government. They are dreaming about building the Temple Mount again. Things that you will believe that normal people don't think about. And they are doing it, and he made Israel different than before. And when you ask how can one convince him to change his policy, it is a democracy. We went down in our number in the world. We were 23, even higher than the United States and others, and now we are 30. But still there are many others under this number. And it is the democracy. It is the next elections. We are trying to do our best to have early elections. And it is the street. The demonstrations, and you saw it on TV, the demonstrations on the street stopped the legal revolution that he and his people tried to enact. And I believe that also in the future, it might help again. The point is that peace seems today to many Israelis, but not only to Israelis, as a very nice dream which will not happen. And it is more difficult to put pressure on a leader to go for peace now than then. I mean, had there been and it might happen, had there been a serious plan on the table, supported by many countries in the world, it would have been easier for the opposition in Israel to say, you see, you have an alternative, go for it. Regretfully, what the situation today is that it seems as if there is no alternative, and the alternatives which are available don't seem serious enough or feasible enough for most of the Israelis. My only hope that it will be a very temporary situation.
I think we went 25 minutes over time, so I only have a possibility to allow for one more question before we take the coffee break. But our panelists will be here for all of you, dear students, to approach them and to answer your questions. So last question, Anastasia.
Okay, thank you. I'm actually one of the participants of the first School for Young Leaders 15 years ago. So I would like to thank President Ivanov for this opportunity, and it's great to see that this continued for 15 years and we have this event today here. So I have just one question. During the discussions you mentioned that some of the participants mentioned that leaders actually sometimes and often have to take actions which are not accepted by the public and the majority of the people. But isn't this in contrast with the general principle of democracy, that actually people rule? So democracy is rule of the people, and now we are saying that leaders have to take actions which are not supported by the public. So I was just wondering if some of you, if you have opinion on this contrast in principles.
So I was planning to wrap up the discussion immediately, but it will take another hour, I suppose, to answer this question. So President Ivanic, please.
I will give you one example. I was Prime Minister of Republika Srpska, so Serbs dominated that area. 5 years after the war, there was rebuilding of the mosque in Banja Luka. There were huge riots because the Serbs believed that this is the provocation, and there was the chaos on the streets of my city, and we had at that time huge presence of the international forces. There were tanks close to the place where everything happened. The protesters put all these Muslims in one house. They wanted to burn them. The general of the international forces called me and said that he will start with the tanks to try to free them. Serbs had a lot of weapons at that time. They didn't care about the tanks because that was normal life for them for 4 years. So there could be a real bloodshed. I decided to enter in the house where the Muslims were there in order to simply to be there, in order to make a pressure on the police to start to behave like any other police. It was the chaos there. When it finished somehow without victims, just one person was killed, which is nothing comparing with the potential problems there. I came to my house and my daughter asked me, why you were the only one who was with the Muslims? Why all the children attacked me in the school? Because you were there. She was only 9 years old. There was huge protest against me by the public in front of my house, in front of my office for the days. 3 years later, I was again re-elected. So the majority was against my step at that moment, but later they recognized that it was right to do something like that. And I was again re-elected. So I did something during my term which was not accepted by the people at the beginning, but 4 years later, when the people have the right to, again, to decide, are you really? So I don't see any contradiction in these steps. If I did what the public believed at that time, I would be in the protests, and I would send Molotov cocktails on that building where the Muslims were. The same applies to the politics. At the beginning, some part of the public doesn't understand everything. But once you did something, later public accept that. One big problem in Bosnia was single army. You know, after the war, we decided to have a single army. A lot of people didn't accept that. Today, army is not the issue anymore. No one thinks about the army. Everybody almost believed that it was a relatively good solution. So I don't think that this is in contradictions. Quite differently, a lot of leaders in the history, they did something which was not always accepted at the beginning by the people, but in long term, yes.
So we will wrap up the session just by one short remark by First Minister Salmond.
Well, can I add to the thanks to President Ivanov? And yesterday morning, he taught me everything about Macedonian history from the days of Alexander onwards, in one single morning, which was, and I'm so grateful. But the President here has it quite right. You could do things which are unpopular, but if the public and the people believe over a period of time you did them for the right motives, then you won't. And that's the essence of leadership. I mean, 11 years ago, I offered the UK government, I said, look, we want to stop this political union, which is not working, but you can have a monarchical union, keep the late Queen as head of state, we can be in the European Union, we can have a defence union, we can have a social union, we can have a monetary union. And they didn't accept that at the time, and a lot of my own side, I mean, for goodness sake, Michael Collins was shot by his own people in Ireland for proposing something similar 100 years ago. Now, I wasn't in danger of getting shot. But neither was any real danger of losing popularity, because people believe you're doing it for the right reasons, even if the initiative you're making is unpopular at that point. If people accept your motivations, then you'll be all right in the end. And the essence of leadership is to understand that, not just to bend with popular opinion. Popular opinion, yes, it can be interpreted as democracy, but if you're going to get reconciliation, if you're going to make a deal, if you're going to make something that all sides can accept that stands the test of time, then you've got to have the ability to recognize the moments where you have to defy popular opinion.
So I have to assume leadership now and take the unpopular decision of ending this wonderful discussion. So thank you very much, my dear panelists, for addressing the students. And I look forward to the coffee break. You can all approach our panelists and ask the questions that you were so eager to ask, but we're already half an hour over our time, so we have to take the coffee break. Thank you very much.